Irish, Italian, and Jewish people when they moved out in the 60s during that period of time, and then left this empty movie set where people can come and invent themselves. And the sheer lack of money and structure created these kind of things. I mean, I remember when I was driving a taxi in 1974, I wanted to see to one of these disco places that Freddy was talking about, and I was amazed to see there was like white people and black people and gay people and straight people all in the same room. And like I grew up in New York City, I never saw that before. But it was basically because there was this kind of like leveling of the playing field because there was no money around. So there was no kind of aspirational kind of thing where people like tend to click into that kind of sense like, well, I'll be this, I'll be a lawyer, I'll do this. It didn't really seem like, it seemed like any day, the next day, the whole thing was going to blow up, so you might as well just be a graffiti guy or, you know, plug your guitar into a thing. And it kind of like, it sort of like was this beginning of this year, this kind of Pol Pot idea of this year zero kind of thing going on, which was actually, and you could like, well, it was year zero and you paved everything over, you can just invent yourself up because there was no past. And they could go ahead and do that.
But even in South Brooklyn, there was a, you know, everybody went to the World's Fair, and they came back and they came back to Park Slope and they saw the wood and the brownstones and they wanted to be modern, so they painted it all up. And the next thing you know, heroin hits and the money goes and everybody started running away. Then all you smelled in the neighborhood for about 5 years was paint remover. And all you kept hearing people saying is, I can't believe they painted this over. And then, but they would go at night when they'd done removing the paint, they'd go to like the Camper Down Elm, one of those bars, and they would meet with people who were still, you know, like regular Brooklyn people. And there was this kind of wonderful period of time when you get this great mixes. I mean, there was this crazy guy, Georgie Ryan, came back from Vietnam, wanted to kill everybody, and then he met a photographer who was there removing paint all the time, and Georgie got inspired to try photography, and now he does these unbelievable photographs of flowers blooming. I mean, he spends thousands of hours waiting for the flowers to bloom, and he does these unbelievable photographs. And, you know, that probably saved him from killing about 50 people. But there was that transition time where you had that mix with the end of the boom and before the next, there was that kind of extended period that you were talking about. I guess a lot of it had to do with money. I mean,
was there a point when you know, together think the 70s ended? How did you date it?
I think they ended in 1979.
I know it ended in
you know,
go ahead.
you know, most generations, like you said, 1971 was still part of the 60s. You know, most generations go, you know, a little bit into the next decade before the you know, the 60s really started. They didn't really start till 64 or so, you know, and you know, the 70s didn't start till 74 or so, and the 80s just started in 1980, man. You know, just boom, shoo.
I think it's really interesting, and I think you need about 20 years to really be able to put a decade in place, because kind of when you're in the middle of it, for me, I know on the art, you know, painting side of it all, with, you know, I know myself and Keith Haring and Jean-Michel and that whole crew that I hung out with, everybody was definitely had read about everything that happened in the 60s with Warhol scene and stuff, and just thought that that was the coolest period. So we were really consciously, I know a lot of us trying to like recreate the, you know, the cool things that had happened in a time when we weren't able to hang out or old enough to go to cool parties and cool clubs. And, you know, you can be a filmmaker in a band, a writer, and just be really cool about it. But then there was also, you know, and that was, I know a lot of what we were thinking about in that kind of downtown realm. Like, yeah, you can just be a filmmaker, or you can wake up, you know, the next day and just want to be in a band, and you could literally have friends come and see you. I know that's how the Fun Gallery, which was actually the first gallery in the East Village, the idea was really like a joke, you know, like Patty Astor, who was the, you know, the dealer. She had been an underground film star in the 70s, and guys like Eric Mitchell and James Nares and those guys had put her in films, and one film which was like a really bad B-movie version of Sunset Boulevard. which I thought was great. It's called Underground USA, and you know, the idea was to have this little space at this storefront on East 10th Street, and to invite all your friends to come and see paintings. So it was really simple. But then when real dealers and collectors started to show up, it got serious like really quick.
When did the dealers really start to
Well,
show up?
like immediately, like at the first shows we had at the Fun Gallery, which were like in 1980. But see, there was a, you know, and we're moving into,
80 though.
yeah, we're moving into the 80s. But it was that East Village sensibility, because once again, you know, Klaus Oldenburg had a storefront in the 60s in East Village and made a lot of art, and so many other, you know, cool people lived in the neighborhood for, you know, with the proverbial cheap rent, which, you know, is now long gone.
I think that underscores the fact that the 70s ended, like 78, 79, since what you are describing is the 80s. And we went out of business in 79. Sid killed Nancy, that whole incident at the Chelsea Hotel. Sid committed suicide. Punk rock was over with. And I remember hanging out at some of the hardcore punk clubs in like 1980, 1981. And that was the other side of punk rock. That's what punk rock transformed itself into. But that was the 80s again. So the 70s were, I guess, CBGB's and Studio 54. I think Studio 54 had some trouble by the early 80s, right?
That tax,
It's interesting, Don Letts just made this movie called Punk Attitude that I think John and I are in, and it's interesting when you're watching the movie, it's really exciting, and you see all these great bands, you know, like Lenny's up there and stuff, you know, and then when it gets to the 80s, you know, the movie just slows down, you know, and you leave for a cigarette, you know, and then Nirvana comes back in 1990 and everything starts picking up again, you know, but the 80s were, geez, I mean, I think for white people, the 80s were awful, you know? I mean, what interesting person did anything interesting who was white in the 80s, you know? It's kind of a hard question, you know? I mean, black guys were doing great stuff, and they were doing rap and, you know, taking over the world, you know? And we had Sting, you know? Stink, you know, I mean, God. You know, and just these horrible bands, oh.
they came at night in the camper down Elm in Brooklyn when two Wall Street kids were flipping a quarter for $20 a shot, and they left the quarter for the bartender as a tip. So that's, to me, that was 1980s right there.
Wow.
I always remember looking at that quarter sitting on the bar there as they walked out the door.
That's brutal, that's brutal.
No matter how many interesting stories you tell, Michael can always top you.
No, I ain't trying to top none. You had the
Great.
best, the empty movie set's the best line of the evening. That is, no doubt about it.
That sets the template.
It must have been, you were having all that fun and I'm out going to,
Well, you had a
Homicide
column. I mean, he was a
scenes, holy
columnist, so
shit.
you know, having a weekly column is really, you know, hard.
painting, I thought they should have done it. They should have outlined the bodies with paint and that really would have
I
scared
know,
the
that
shit
would
out
have
of
been
people, 'cause
great.
you
You
would have so
know,
many.
would have saved the graffiti artists.
I'd like to point out that Legs was working for a film company at the time. So New York was an empty movie set for him.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that, John. And we could ride on top of the trucks over like the
That
Brooklyn
must have
Bridge.
been
It
a
was
great
really
time at
amazing.
CBGB when that stuff- It must have been. How do you look so healthy?
Well, I'd like to mention the 60s.
Really, you must. I mean, you look very,
Without the 60s, there wouldn't have been a
very
70s.
clear.
In the East Village,
I'm going to go smoke.
there was a great scene going on in the 60s with the East Village, let's see, the Fillmore
Got a
East,
very clear.
the Electric Circus,
Nice, nice. At the end, you know.
as Lenny said, Max's, so.
Nicotine addict.
Well, let's see. I think maybe, unless somebody's got some last points they want to interject here.
I think everybody was skinnier in the 70s. That's the biggest difference between then and now.
Didn't Son of Sam happen in the 70s?
But I mean,
Son of
even
Sam?
young people were skinnier.
Well,
Everybody was skinny back then.
Yeah, Skinny was in, but I remember the whole Son of Sam. That was pretty intense and scary. That was a big ongoing 70s drama.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that although it's an interesting question about why it was different for blacks and whites, but one of the things about the 80s and eventually Rudy's sensibility was the restoration of order, and that it was precisely in opposition and in fear of some of the, the body bags on the street, but also more generally an anarchic culture that was powering some of that. And if you're into order in a serious way, it's not easy to be quite so creative.
They were worried about squeegee men.
Yeah.
There's 2,000 people murdered a year in the city, and they're talking about squeegee people at the tunnels.
Yeah, well, for them, of course, remember they had a theory that one thing leads to the other, and that squeegee leads to
I mean, you feel that Reagan was created by the New York in the 1970s to some degree?
Well, I think what Reagan and his crew were doing was an extension of the kind of operations that were undertaken by, say, the Emergency Financial Control Board in the 1970s. That it was, in fact, a crackdown on blacks. Racism is really back in a somewhat coded way, but not that coded. It's a crackdown on labor. It was, I think, a reinscribing of boundaries. It was also, just crudely, it was a cutback on social welfare policies. I mean, the kind of stuff that we're now in the last throes of. Now they're after Social Security, but that's the end of a sequence which really starts here in the 70s. And people like Bill Simon, who are right at the center of this, going after the entitlements, going after free tuition at the city university. I mean, this was considered to be an outrage. Crypto-communism was in fact then extended on the national level when these guys, some of the same people, Simon is after all Secretary of the Treasury, come to power on the national scene.
So it was those nasty punks down in CBGBs that have given us this past.
We have this to thank.
I was going to ask, what does this have to do with?
Responsibility. He went out in the street here to smoke a cigarette.
What does this have to do with people being skinnier back then? See, Soylent Green is people. Remember that.
Well, thank you so much for sharing and thinking and. Well, it's early days, but we got to begin to think about putting
Yeah, no, mention you do your work well. Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Some big place.
Yes, that's the biggest story that's going on.
Just tell me today, because I saw
The Jews kind of were let in, though,
Yes, they were, but
after the Second War, the Holocaust.
they was at Tribeca Film Festival. Thanks so much.
I'm gone for like.